Darcy's Redemption, The Way of Humility. Chapter 1. The morning after the Meryton Ball, the autumnal sun streamed mercilessly through the long windows of the breakfast parlor at Netherfield Park, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and the sharp tension between the room's only occupants. Charles Bingley stood by the mantel, tapping a silver sugar tongs against the marble mantelpiece, a habit indicative of deep agitation. Fitzwilliam Darcy was seated at the head of the table, impeccably dressed as always, contemplating a cup of cold coffee with aristocratic distaste. He had the air of a man who expected to be annoyed, but not challenged. Finally, Bingley dropped the tongs with a clatter. "I invited you here, Darcy," Bingley began, his cheerful voice stripped of its usual warmth, "to help me settle in, to be good company, and perhaps, occasionally, to offer advice on the management of an estate. I did not invite you to ruin my relationships with the entire neighborhood before I've been in Meryton a fortnight." Darcy raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow, setting the coffee cup down with a deliberate click. "Ruin them, Bingley? I assure you my interactions last night were models of restraint. For the first time in my life, I mastered the art of listening to utter nonsense without once offering a correction." Bingley began to pace, his fair hair slightly tousled by worry. "Do not be obtuse, Darcy. You know precisely what I mean. I am referring to the manner in which you conducted yourself when introduced to the Bennet family, the manner in which you refused to dance, your conversation overheard by a dozen people, and your subsequent general air of superiority that managed to offend almost every mother in the room. And you are certain," Darcy countered, his tone cool, intellectually dismissive, "that my mere presence is not enough to offend the sensibilities of these provincial neighbors? I am accustomed to the knowledge that my honest observations are often received with offense, as very few of the social sphere are accustomed to a genuine critique of their own society." Bingley stopped his pacing abruptly and faced his friend, his blue eyes flashing with a rare anger. "This is not about your honest observations on the state of Hertfordshire society, Darcy. This is about your conduct toward a specific young lady and the consequences of your careless cruelty. What in heaven's name did you mean by your words concerning Miss Elizabeth Bennet?" Darcy looked genuinely perplexed. He searched his memory for any interaction with the second Miss Bennet, finding only a vague recollection of a spirited face and an impertinent gaze. "I confess I do not follow you," Darcy replied. "I believe I declined an introduction to her later in the evening, but I recall no particular exchange. Was she perhaps one of the 4 women whom I was forced to assure that I had no intention of purchasing the entire county?" Bingley leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a furious, strained whisper. "The meaning, Darcy, is that you spoke aloud, within 5 feet of the girl, that she was tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt you. You uttered those words to me while observing her, and she assuredly heard them." A flicker, not of guilt but of annoyance at his own lapse, passed across Darcy's features. He remembered the moment now. Bingley had encouraged him to dance with Miss Bennet, and he had given his honest assessment, completely forgetting that decorum required such thoughts, however true, to be kept entirely private. "If Miss Bennet overheard a private sentiment, then that is unfortunate," Darcy said stiffly, "but I cannot be held responsible for the accidental eavesdropping of every person who crowds the floor of a local assembly." "Accidental?" Bingley exclaimed. "It was not accidental. We were standing beside her, waiting for the set to begin. She turned immediately, red in the face, and retreated to her seat. And it was not only Miss Elizabeth. Several young men and the young Lucases were near enough to hear every insulting syllable. They looked at you, Darcy, astonished, and then they all looked at me. They looked at me as if I were responsible for exposing a young lady to such a degrading public slight." Bingley rubbed his forehead, his usual ebullience utterly extinguished by frustration. "I invited you here to help me appear settled and reliable. I am attempting to cultivate friendly relations with my neighbors, for the sake of companionship and, dare I say it, for the sake of Miss Bennet's sister, whose acquaintance I wish to pursue with every propriety. How am I to call upon Longbourn again, knowing that one of my guests has already established himself as a callous brute in the eyes of the entire family?" Darcy felt a rare prickle of discomfort. He cared little for the opinions of the general populace of Meryton, but he cared intensely for Bingley's good opinion and social success. He had intended his honesty to be a private observation to his friend, a way to pass the time during a dull evening, not a weapon wielded in public. He rose now, straightening his waistcoat. His expression remained severe, but the coldness in his eyes softened slightly, acknowledging the validity of Bingley's distress. "Very well, Bingley," Darcy conceded, his voice grudging. "Allow me to apologize for the lapse in judgment regarding the volume of my commentary. It was an oversight, and truly I had assumed that in such a loud assemblage, a private remark would remain so." He paused, then added, unable to completely divest himself of his pride, "though my assessment of the young lady's face remains unalterable." Bingley threw up his hands. "The assessment is irrelevant. It is the hearing of the assessment that matters. You have created an enemy of a girl who, I assure you, is very highly regarded for her wit and spirit, and you have made me appear a party to your rudeness." He stepped closer, his voice earnest. "I require your promise, Darcy. If you cannot find it in your heart to praise anyone here, then you must endeavor to remain silent. If you wish to observe the inhabitants of Meryton as one observes specimens in a cabinet, I shall allow it, but your observations must remain locked within your own mind. I need to make a home here, and I cannot allow your pride to jeopardize my comfort or that of my sisters, or that of the kind people I hope to call my friends." The two men stood in a silence heavy with misunderstanding. Darcy, accustomed to being admired for his frankness, found himself suddenly criticized not for his opinion, but for his sheer social ineptitude. He looked at Bingley, seeing the genuine distress of his friend, and knew that for once his superior intellect had failed him completely in the practical art of life. "You have my word, Charles," Darcy stated, the promise measured and firm. "I shall endeavor to be, if not agreeable, then at the very least, silent." "See that you are," Bingley muttered, sinking into a chair with a sigh. "Good God, Darcy, we have only just arrived, and already we are the subject of universal ridicule. And now I suppose I must call upon Longbourn this afternoon and attempt to charm the family back into forgetting that my dearest friend considers their daughter merely tolerable." Chapter 2. The fire in the grate of the Netherfield drawing-room had long been banked, but in his borrowed chamber, Fitzwilliam Darcy found the heat of his own vexation far more uncomfortable than the chill autumn air. He stood by the window, the heavy velvet curtain pulled back just enough to reveal the black expanse of the Hertfordshire night. Behind him, the sound of Charles Bingley's cheerful, oblivious snoring drifted faintly through the thick walls. It was Bingley's words, uttered hours ago over the port, that had driven Darcy into this state of simmering annoyance. Why was he so annoyed by such simple advice? Because it challenged the fundamental structure of his world, his superiority. He paced the rug, the sound of his boots muffled by the plush pile. Did Bingley demand that he be agreeable to everyone? To the vulgar Mrs. Bennet, whose nerves were as tiresome as her social ambition? To the tedious diners of Meryton, whose sole topics were gossip and paltry fortunes? It was an obligation, he convinced himself, to maintain a certain distance. His position was not comparable to Bingley's. Bingley was merely wealthy. Darcy was the master of Pemberley. His lineage, his vast estates, his duty to his tenants and his sister placed him on a plane far removed from the petty gentry of this small county. Was it not his right to show his superiority? He was superior. He was better read, better educated, possessed of greater consequence, and frankly, better manners, at least among acceptable company. The neighbors were beneath him, certainly, and even Bingley, for all his goodness, lacked true gravitas and judgment. Darcy managed himself and thousands of others. Bingley merely managed his bank account. The thought concluded with a sense of decisive, cold satisfaction, yet it failed to quell the unrest in his spirit. If he were so superior, why did he feel so defensive? Why did the casual observation of his well-meaning friend feel like an accusation? He stopped before the mantelpiece, catching his reflection in the glass of a framed engraving. The face that looked back was handsome, yes, but proud, hardened by the expectation of deference. But does that make him superior? The question, unwelcome and insidious, introduced a crack in the fortress of his pride. He remembered the look in Bingley's eyes, not of criticism, but genuine concern that his friend was unnecessarily isolating himself. Bingley, who possessed only a fraction of Darcy's status, seemed infinitely richer in happiness and popular regard. Darcy picked up a small leather-bound volume that had been set upon the desk, a collection of divinity essays his aunt, Lady Catherine, insisted upon as suitable bedside reading. He opened the pages almost unconsciously, and his eye fell upon a passage marked in faint pencil. It was a commentary on the New Testament, recalling familiar lessons from his childhood tutor. His gaze fixed first upon the severe, clear injunction, "Do unto others as you would have them do unto you." Matthew 7:12. Darcy frowned. The scripture admitted no such qualifications of rank or intellect. It demanded reciprocity in treatment, not reciprocity in social standing. If he were in a position of lesser consequence, say, visiting a powerful peer he wished to impress, he would desire courtesy, acknowledgement, and the simple relief of being treated as though his presence were not an intrusion. He had denied these very basic dignities to others, not because they had offended him, but because he deemed them unworthy of his effort. His aloofness was not merely reserve, it was actively inflicted injury. He turned the page, the inner turmoil growing sharper, and his eyes fell upon a second, even more damning admonition. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves. Philippians 2:3. The words struck him with the force of a physical blow, dismantling the carefully constructed edifice of his rationale. Selfish ambition, vain conceit. He saw clearly now that his behavior at the assembly, his coldness at the dinner table, had nothing to do with upholding the honor of Pemberley. It was the purest form of vanity. He had dismissed the Meryton neighbors, not because he feared contamination, but because he enjoyed the sensation of looking down. He had taken pleasure in the knowledge that he was the most important, the cleverest, the wealthiest man in the room, and had used silence and frowns as instruments to enforce that belief upon the general company. By valuing his own comfort, his own time, and his own perceived superiority above the simple right of others to be treated with common civility, he had fallen short of his own standards of conduct. His superiority in estate was undeniable, but did that superiority extend to his morality and his character? Bingley, whose greatest flaw was perhaps being too agreeable, managed to fulfill the moral duty outlined in the scriptures effortlessly. While Darcy was calculating hierarchies, Bingley was extending warmth. Darcy closed the book, the leather cool against his palm. He was educated, responsible, and wealthy. Yet he had allowed his pride to make him less of a gentleman than his friend. He had failed the ultimate test of Christian conduct. The realization settled over him, not as a pleasant enlightenment, but as a weighty, miserable conviction. He could not ignore it. Bingley had been right, not just socially, but fundamentally. His deportment was a reflection of his soul's deficiency. He needed to change, not by forcing himself to enjoy the company of tiresome people, but by recognizing their inherent worth and affording them the dignity he would demand for himself. He had been concerned with the appearance of consequence. Now he felt the urgent need to obtain genuine, self-respecting conduct. He stood silent for a long moment, watching the faint moonlight struggle to pierce the cloud cover. The path ahead suddenly seemed tedious and humbling. He had to learn how to interact with the world without constantly measuring it against Pemberley. The first dreadful step would be the hardest. He had to admit, silently and perhaps only to himself, that Fitzwilliam Darcy had been wrong, and he had to start correcting his behavior tomorrow. His mind replayed the scene in the Meryton assembly, an unwelcome, vivid tableau. Bingley, ever eager to please, urging him to dance, his own dismissive survey of the room, and then that infamous whispered comment concerning Miss Elizabeth Bennet. She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me, and I am in no humor at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men. The words, so casually uttered, so firmly rooted in his accustomed pride, now echoed with a hollow, ugly resonance. He had been rude, inexcusably so, and to a lady whose vivacity, even then, had pierced his usual indifference. The thought of changing himself, of tempering his pride, was a novel and frankly irritating sensation. He, Fitzwilliam Darcy, Master of Pemberley, was not accustomed to admitting fault, least of all to himself. Yet the conviction that his conduct had been beneath him, beneath the standards he held for a gentleman, gnawed at him. But what to do about the words of insult that he had expressed in the Meryton ball about Miss Elizabeth? To offer a direct apology? The very notion sent a cold shiver down his spine. His pride, that impermeable shield forged by birth and circumstance, would not allow for such an open capitulation. To admit error so explicitly to a country girl, one whom he had so lightly dismissed, was unthinkable. It would be a surrender, a public abasement. No, there must be another way, a path that demonstrated his altered sentiments without requiring him to kneel at the altar of his own acknowledged folly. He considered the intricate dance of social courtesies, the unspoken language of gesture and glance. And then a solution presented itself, subtle yet significant. In the next suitable occasion, a ball, a party, any gathering where the social rituals permitted, he would ask Miss Elizabeth Bennet to dance. Not with the grudging reluctance he had shown before, not as a favor, but with deliberate courtesy, a respectful invitation. A public dance, he reasoned, was an implicit acknowledgement of worth, a signal that she was not beneath his notice, that his earlier remark had been a momentary lapse, not a permanent judgment. It would show her respect. Surely that would be enough to atone for his rudeness, to subtly retract his harsh estimation without the ignominy of a direct apology. Surely that would be sufficient. And there were other avenues to demonstrate this nascent change. Bingley, in his boundless good nature, would undoubtedly call upon the Bennet family soon. Darcy decided he would join him, not to flatter nor to feign interest in their trivial discourse, but merely to be present, to show that he did not disdain their acquaintance so utterly as his previous conduct might have suggested. His presence, ungrudgingly given, would be a quiet testament, and in his general comportment, he would endeavor for greater civility. When someone spoke to him, he would try to answer politely and respectfully, rather than with his usual curtness or disdainful silence. He laid in his bed, a flicker of something akin to self-satisfaction warming his austere features. These were significant changes, subtle perhaps to the unobservant, but momentous to Fitzwilliam Darcy. He was not abandoning his principles, merely refining his conduct. He was not stooping. He was, in his own estimation, elevating his own standards. He had found a path forward, a way to mend what was broken without shattering his formidable pride. Yes, he thought, a dance, a shared call, and a renewed effort at politeness. That would be quite sufficient. Chapter 3. The Meryton assembly was loud, overheated, and ill-lit, yet Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy found himself in a state of unusual self-possession. Since the disastrous first impression he had made, a stubborn sense of propriety, and perhaps a growing, unwanted admiration for Miss Elizabeth Bennet's intelligence, had determined him to repair the breach. He owed her and himself the courtesy of an apology, however subtle. The opportunity presented itself precisely when he least expected it, in the person of Sir William Lucas. Sir William, beaming with self-importance, had managed to steer Darcy into a quiet corner while observing the country dances. "My dear Mr. Darcy," he began, placing a heavy hand on Darcy's sleeve, "a gentleman of your consequence must be amused by the simplicity of our rural pleasures. Though simple, they are hearty. Observe my Miss Elizabeth, praying pardon, Miss Bennet. Does she not possess a countenance of uncommon spirit?" Darcy followed the direction of his gaze. Elizabeth was laughing at a partner's clumsy movement, her eyes sparkling with genuine, unaffected mirth. She was entirely engrossed in the dance and oblivious that she was being discussed. "Her form is unexceptionable, Sir William," Darcy replied, his voice measured. He prepared himself to speak of her wit, a compliment he knew to be true, but which stuck in his throat like a stone. Sir William, misunderstanding the careful neutrality, plunged ahead. Excellent, excellent! Such beauty deserves a partner worthy of her. Mr. Darcy, though you declared yourself averse to dancing, I feel confident that a turn about the room with my favorite Miss Bennet would quite overcome your scruples. She is, as you observe, charming. Allow me to introduce the proposition at once. Darcy paused. This was far more public than he had intended, yet Sir William's bluntness allowed for a clear, immediate statement of respectful regard. It was a chance to prove, by deed, that he was capable of offering a civility to one whom he had previously slighted. Sir William, I should be happy to... Before he could finish, Sir William was already gesturing wildly toward Elizabeth, who had just concluded her set. She approached them, slightly breathless, but her gaze instantly sharpened upon seeing Darcy. Miss Bennet, Sir William cried, here is a compliment which does honor to our house. Mr. Darcy, struck by your grace, has been persuaded to stand up. He desires the felicity of your hand for the next dance. Elizabeth's color heightened, yet it was not from pleasure. Her expression hardened into a look of polite, resolute refusal that pierced Darcy instantly. She curtsied, low and precise. I thank you for the honor, Sir William, and thank Mr. Darcy for his condescension. However, I have sworn myself out of the dance for the rest of the evening. Sir William was mortified. My dear, you surely jest. This is Mr. Darcy. I am perfectly serious, Elizabeth said, her voice remaining perfectly steady, though her eyes were firmly fixed on the floor just past Darcy's polished boots. I am overheated and must rest. I cannot stand up again. She offered a swift, final curtsy and was gone, swept away by Jane and a chorus of local acquaintances. Darcy stood alone, the air thick with Sir William's stammered apologies. The rejection was complete and entirely public. Not only had he been refused, but she had used the very word condescension that encapsulated his earlier offense, turning his attempt at atonement into a fresh humiliation. Later that night, the cold silence of Netherfield Park enveloped him. Darcy dismissed his valet with a brusque nod and paced the length of his luxurious chamber. His elegant coat lay discarded across a chair, and the heavy velvet curtains offered little resistance to the moonlight that spilled over the rug. He was furious. The initial, measured regret he had felt earlier in the week, the recognition that his arrogant dismissal of the Meryton Society had been unjust, had entirely vanished, replaced by scorching, wounded pride. What right had she to humiliate him so? He had extended a hand, an act that cost him a great deal of internal struggle, and she had slapped it away with a sharp, judgmental pride that equaled his own worst faults. He stopped at the window, staring out at the dark, silent park. Such a stupid girl. Her spirit was nothing more than impertinence. Her quickness, simple petulance. He had attempted to be agreeable, to mitigate his error, and she had repaid him with scorn witnessed by half the room. He would not try again. He would not lower himself to such attempts at conciliation. She deserves nothing, he muttered, clenching his fists. I shall show that girl in every glance, in every careful avoidance, exactly how low I think of her behavior, her family, and her entire ignorant society. He would be colder, more aloof, and more obviously disgusted by their company than he had ever been. He would punish her insolence with the weapon of his own superiority. The thought brought a savage satisfaction, a righteous indignation that felt justified after the sting of her rejection. He turned toward the heavy mahogany bed, his mind racing with schemes of pointed contempt, when a phrase, sharp and unexpected, cut through the selfish clamor of his fury, silencing him instantly. He remembered a lesson impressed upon him in his youth by his tutor, a man of deep piety and severe principle, words carved from the Epistle of James. The memory was stark, appearing suddenly as a cold, unblinking truth amidst the blinding heat of his anger. Everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. James 1:19-20. Darcy collapsed into a chair, his rapid breathing slowing to a painful halt. slow to become angry. His current state was neither slow nor righteous. He was not plotting vengeance against an impertinent country girl. He was plotting the preservation of his own wounded vanity. His intentions for the following day, his resolve to treat Elizabeth Bennet with open contempt, were not driven by any moral conviction, but by pettiness and wounded pride. He saw with brutal clarity that his anger was not only unproductive, but actively destructive. It was leading him back down the path of arrogance he had just resolved to leave. It mattered little if Elizabeth Bennet was insolent. His own duty was to comport himself with honor and justice, which fury completely precluded. He had to confess it. Anger was not the right reaction, and certainly not the foundation upon which to decide the best way to act in future. He had failed the test of patience, and now he must pay the price of self-correction. He would not be guided by malice. He would be still. He would be watchful. The immediate urge to strike back at Elizabeth Bennet dissolved, leaving behind a profound weariness and the cold, difficult task of mastering himself. The battle with Miss Bennet was nothing compared to the war he waged against Mr. Darcy. The fire in Darcy's Netherfield chamber had dwindled to a low, comforting hiss, casting long, dancing shadows that mimicked the restless thoughts within him. The memory of the Meryton Assembly had not faded, the one where Miss Elizabeth Bennet had so pointedly, so undeniably refused him a dance. He had initially dismissed it as provincial impertinence, a female slight born of misplaced pride. His pride, however, still smarted. He, Fitzwilliam Darcy, refused by a country miss? It was unprecedented. But his mind, ever logical even in its indignation, circled back to a verse he'd encountered in his scripture readings, a verse that had pricked at him even amidst the chaos of London society, even before Meryton. Do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. Galatians 6:7b. At first he'd applied it to the general follies of mankind, to the insidious hypocrisy he often observed. Now, in the quiet solitude of his room, with only the embers for company, the words began to take on a more personal, a more pointed meaning. He had sown. What had he sown? His gaze drifted to the window, black as pitch, reflecting only his own troubled countenance. The image of Elizabeth Bennet, her eyes bright with a spirited defiance, flashed before him. Her refusal had been sharp, clear, and undeniably public. He had felt the eyes of the room on him, the suppressed whispers, the quiet triumph of those who had always found him too haughty. A flush rose to his face, not of anger, but of a dawning, terrible understanding. He had not been mocked by God, nor by the world, but by the very echo of his own words. Meryton, the First Assembly. He had stood there bored and disdainful. The words, so casually, so arrogantly uttered, now came back to him with the force of a physical blow. He had not seen her then, only the general mass of country gentry. But she had seen him. She had heard him. The puzzle pieces clicked into place with a sickening precision. Her spirited eyes, her quick wit, her undeniable intelligence, all had been met by his condescension. He had judged her, dismissed her, and even insulted her, within earshot, believing himself above consequence. And then, when he had asked her to dance at the Second Assembly, feeling a belated, almost grudging admiration stir within him, he had been met with her refusal. A public refusal. A humiliation. A man reaps what he sows. The truth was stark, undeniable. He could not accuse Elizabeth Bennet of rudeness, of ill-breeding, or of any fault whatsoever in that moment. Her refusal was not a random act of spite, but a direct, natural consequence of his own egregious error. He had sown contempt and reaped rejection. He had sown insult and reaped disdain. The anger he had harbored towards her dissolved, replaced by a profound, humbling self-reproach. He had been so blind, so consumed by his own pride and superior notions, that he had failed to see his own contribution to the very slight he now felt. His previous resolutions to be more amiable, to try and cultivate a better disposition, now felt insufficient, almost superficial. This was not merely about being polite. It was about fundamental respect, respect for all individuals, regardless of their family connections, their fortune, or their social standing. He had treated her as less than, and she had quite rightly responded in kind. He could not undo his words, nor the hurt they had caused. But he could change the harvest. He could and must sow differently from this moment forward. He would cultivate courtesy, even humility. He would listen before he judged. He would offer respect, even when it felt difficult, even when his old pride wrestled against it. The fire in the grate finally died to ash. But in Darcy's heart, a new tentative flame began to glow, the flame of genuine understanding, and the earnest desire for a different, more honorable harvest. He had much to learn and much to atone for, but at least now he understood the first lesson. Chapter 4. The horse ride back to Netherfield Park was quiet, but the silence was a vacuum filled by the roar of Fitzwilliam Darcy's own tempestuous mind. He sat stiffly, his gaze fixed on the passing countryside, seeing none of it, seeing only the smirking face of George Wickham in the dusty marketplace of Meryton. He had expected the cut. He had expected the calculated, theatrical shock lighting up Wickham's eyes the moment they met. But what truly curdled the blood in Darcy's veins was the ease with which Wickham had immediately settled into the role of the charming, wronged martyr. He had witnessed the sly, sideways glances exchanged with the young ladies of the town, specifically Miss Elizabeth Bennet of Longbourn, the one whose spirit he had already come to admire, and had understood instantly Wickham was employing the same practiced elegance, the same false sympathy to acquire new victims. How he hated that man. The hatred was a physical thing, a corrosive acid that tightened his jaw and clawed at his chest. It was not merely dislike or even contempt. It was a profound, justified detestation for a soul that seemed incapable of integrity. Darcy catalogued the inventory of Wickham's ruin, starting not with malice but with waste. His father had provided for Wickham, offering the promise of a comfortable living, a good education, and social indemnity. Wickham had abandoned every possibility of a respectable life, trading stability for immediate, fleeting pleasures. And yet he had never accepted the consequences of his own choices. He had always inevitably turned back toward Pemberley, demanding more. And when denied, he had woven a narrative of Darcy's cruelty, blaming the master for results entirely of his own dissolute making. And the memory of Georgiana was a sharper spike, piercing through the layers of resentment. Not just the deception, but the cold, financial calculation. Wickham had not sought her because he loved her. He had sought her for the £30,000 that would be secured upon her marriage. He had targeted a 15-year-old girl, vulnerable and trusting, exploiting her affection with the precision of a predator, stopping short only because Darcy had intervened, shattered and shaken, hours before the ruin was complete. Even now, miles away from London, miles from any substantial fortune, Wickham was playing the charming gentleman, the innocent victim, solely to acquire the fleeting affections or perhaps the lasting ruin of innocent girls whose reputations were their only currency. Darcy hated him for the past, hated him for the present, and loathed the certainty that Wickham would continue his vile pattern into the future. The hatred was absolute, consuming. It was, he recognized with a shudder, becoming the dominant feature of his own emotional landscape, shaping his reactions and clouding his judgment. Then a quiet, insistent voice, echoing from the rigorous theological training of his youth, broke through the noise. It was not a voice of judgment, but of guidance, pulled from the epistle to the Ephesians. Get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. Ephesians 4:31-32. Darcy leaned back, rubbing his temples hard. He was forced to confront the appalling truth. The hatred he nursed was not harming Wickham. It was poisoning Darcy himself. Was hate something that made his life more worthy of living? Did it grant happiness or contentment? The answer was a definitive no. Hate was a destructive power, a venom that ensured he would forever remain mentally shackled to the man who sought to injure him. Through hate, he would only poison his own existence. becoming as bitter and twisted in spirit as the man he despised in fact. But could he ever forgive Wickham? Even when Wickham would undoubtedly continue to ruin lives just beyond the edge of Darcy's influence. What did forgiveness mean at all? Darcy wrestled with the concept. Forgiveness, he realized, implied that something evil had indeed been done. It did not magically transform the evil deed into a good one, nor did it require him to forget the gravity of the offense. To forgive Wickham was not to exonerate him. It was to cease paying the emotional toll that Wickham had charged on Darcy's soul. He did not need to pretend that the attempt on Georgiana or the lies in Meryton had not occurred. He simply needed to free himself from the resulting poison of resentment and rage. Forgiveness was a liberation. It was a refusal to allow Wickham to continue wielding power over his emotions, his peace, or his future actions. The decision settled upon him like a cool, relieving weight. He would let go of the consuming rage. He would endeavor toward compassion, not necessarily for the man himself, but for the brokenness that created such a vicious character. However, the scripture required kindness and forgiveness between brothers, but it did not command blindness, nor did it prohibit vigilance against ongoing wickedness. Forgiveness did not mean inaction. Darcy understood with perfect clarity that his moral duty, now separated from the haze of personal vengeance, remained unchanged. He could, and assuredly should, continue to take every necessary precaution to ensure that Wickham did not continue his life in a vile, destructive way. He could forgive the past injury to his heart, freeing his spirit, while simultaneously guarding the innocent against future attacks. His purpose became clear and defined. To forgive Wickham was to free Darcy. To protect others from Wickham was simply the responsibility of an honorable man. He would not surrender his vigilance. He would merely cleanse the venom from his motive. The shadow of Wickham would no longer consume the light of his own life. Chapter 5. In the ball of Netherfield Park, the musicians launched into a country dance, a lively reel that demanded quick footwork and a measure of focused attention. Yet for Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy and Miss Elizabeth Bennet, the physical proximity of the dance became merely a confined stage for a private, sharp-tongued war. Elizabeth had accepted his invitation with a mixture of surprise and genuine curiosity. Darcy, seeing perhaps his last opportunity before Wickham's influence became irreparable, had seized the moment with grim determination. "Miss Bennet," he began, his voice low, pitched just beneath the sound of the flutes, "I find myself compelled to speak on a matter that touches upon the welfare of those you associate with." Elizabeth's eyes narrowed, instantly wary. She disliked the superior tone he adopted when offering unsolicited advice. "Indeed, Mr. Darcy? My associates are generally unaccustomed to requiring your counsel." He ignored the retort, driving straight to the point. "I refer to Mr. Wickham. You are forming an attachment based on falsehoods. I warn you, his character is far from what he presents." A flush rose instantly on Elizabeth's cheeks, a crimson tide of indignation. "And you believe your character is so unassailable as to allow you to defame others? I find it remarkable that a man of your wealth and standing requires no evidence but his own assertion to destroy a deserving man's reputation." The movement of the dance separated them briefly, forcing Darcy to wait until their hands met again before he could respond. His jaw tightened. He had expected stubbornness, but not this visceral outrage. "I am speaking of facts, Miss Bennet. Facts concerning monetary issues and a deliberate betrayal of trust that predates his arrival in Meryton." "And I am speaking of consequences," she retorted, her voice hardening. They spun together, their movements sharp and strained. "I have heard the history of his treatment, sir. I have heard how he was promised a living, a future, and how you, in your cold and unforgiving pride, denied him the very means of existence." Darcy stared at her, stunned. Her accusation, delivered with such conviction, demonstrated that Wickham had not merely shaded the truth, he had manufactured a devastating narrative. "You have been gravely misled," Darcy insisted, his voice now edged with true frustration. "You know nothing of the true circumstances." "And you know nothing of justice, sir," Elizabeth countered fiercely. You seek to warn me about a man whose chief offense, it would appear, is that he suffered hardship at your hands. I do not embrace your warnings. I embrace the evidence of my senses. I see a benevolent man suffering under the weight of injustice, and I see his powerful accuser, hiding behind his consequence, afraid of true scrutiny. The accusation of cruelty hit Darcy like a physical blow. He felt his carefully constructed composure fracture. He had endured her light ridicule before. He had even found her frankness admirable. But to be judged a tyrant, a malicious destroyer, and to be condemned by the one woman whose good opinion he cherished, was intolerable. He wanted to expose Wickham, to lay bare the shame of his sister's near ruin, but he could not. Not here, not now, and certainly not to a mind so prejudiced against him. The music stuttered to a halt. The dance was over. For a long, paralyzing moment, they stood facing each other amidst the polite bustle of the dispersing couples. Elizabeth's chest was heaving slightly. Her eyes, usually so sparkling, were dark with anger and disappointment. Darcy's face was pale, rigid with a mixture of wounded pride and profound defeat. He offered the barest, most formal inclination of his head. I perceive, Miss Bennet, that my concern was entirely misplaced. I regret that I subjected you to such an unpleasant conclusion to our dance. The unpleasantness, Mr. Darcy, she returned icily, was solely of your making. Without another word, she turned her back on him and walked swiftly toward her sister. Darcy did not seek out another partner. He retreated immediately, not to the card room, but to the shadowy recess of a small, unused study adjoining the library. He felt like a man who had rushed into a burning house only to be beaten with a stick by the person he intended to save. He paced the confines of the room, the distant sound of the celebratory music mocking his turmoil. She disdains me. She believes me to be inhuman. This was not the gentle misunderstanding he had faced with others. Elizabeth's condemnation stemmed from genuine moral repulsion. She did not merely think him proud, she thought him cruel. And, ironically, the very spirit he had come to admire, her vivacity, her fierce defense of the wronged, her piercing intellect, was the weapon that had separated them entirely. He had meant to save her, and instead he had merely intensified her loathing. What could he do now? The old familiar impulse was defiance, to shrug off her opinion and remember that his family and friends knew his worth. But he could not. Her judgment mattered too much. He had learned to respect her mind, to admire her independence, and, with a painful clarity, he knew he loved her. The rational part of his mind, the part schooled in duty and honor, insisted upon persistence. Forgiveness, Darcy. She is mistaken. You must prove the truth. But the emotional cost was too high. He had bared a measure of concern, a degree of intimacy in his warning, and had been repaid with venomous accusation. He could not remain at Netherfield, forced to endure the daily sight of her expressive eyes turning away from him in contempt. The closeness was unbearable when coupled with her disdain. He could not, would not risk another such collision. His own pride, wounded and bleeding, demanded self-preservation. It was defeat, a complete and stunning rout. Darcy walked out of the study and sought out Bingley, who was laughing easily with an acquaintance near the wine table. "Bingley," Darcy interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "I have received dispatches requiring my immediate presence in town. I must leave." Bingley's smile vanished. "Now, Darcy, but the ball is barely half over. Surely you can wait till morning?" "No. Tonight. I will depart within the hour. Tell your sister I regret the necessity of my abrupt departure." Bingley looked confused, sensing the icy finality in his friend's manner, but saw no point in arguing. "Very well, old fellow. Good speed." Darcy made arrangements with his valet with cold surgical efficiency. No farewells, no lingering glances back into the ballroom where Elizabeth Bennet still moved amongst the dancers, vibrant and utterly unaware of the flight his pride demanded. He had come hoping to guide her, perhaps even to win her. He left Netherfield in full retreat, accepting that the quarrel born on the dance floor had not merely resulted in a misunderstanding, but in a chasm, a separation defined by a judgment he knew to be false, yet was currently incapable of correcting. London, cold and anonymous, was the only sanctuary left where he would not have to look upon the face of the woman who loved his enemy and saw him as hers. Chapter 6. The great house in London was a bastion of quiet, dark luxury, yet to Fitzwilliam Darcy it had become a gilded cage, trapping him with his own desolate thoughts. The clock in the hall chimed the lonely hour of 2, the sound echoing through the lofty, silent rooms, each tick a measurement of his unresolved misery. He stood by the window of his library, the heavy velvet curtain drawn aside just enough to reveal the damp, fog-shrouded streets outside. His usual evening occupations, the accounting of his vast estates, the composition of correspondence, the reading of classical texts, lay abandoned. He had nothing left to occupy him but the endless circular debate within his own mind. He had fallen in love. It was a simple, terrible fact. Miss Elizabeth Bennet. The name itself was a chime of frustration, a melody of impossibility. She had disdained him, wounded his pride with a force no social equal could ever have mustered, and yet, in the wake of that rejection, her image had solidified within him, moving from mere attraction to an inescapable idolatry. He had tried to forget her. He had immersed himself in the bustling society of London, sought the company of sensible, well-bred women, and pursued the rigors of estate management. Everything was in vain. She visited him continuously. In the unguarded moments of the day, when the pen paused over the parchment, her laugh would ring in his memory. At night, she was a constant, shimmering presence in his dreams. Not the Elizabeth who had scorned him, but the lively, spirited creature whose eyes promised wit and fellowship. The situation was unequivocally, brutally hopeless. Darcy forced himself to sit, resting his elbow on the mahogany desk, demanding of himself the rational, deductive calm that had always guided the affairs of the Darcys of Pemberley. He catalogued the impossibilities, reciting them like a penance. Even if, by some miracle, she were to reverse her opinion, even if she were to accept the hand of the master of Pemberley, where would that acceptance lead? To marriage with a lady whose connections were below contempt. The very thought of introducing Mrs. Bennet, with her vulgar nerves and relentless fortune-hunting, to his aunt, Lady Catherine, or even to his beloved sister Georgiana, made him shudder. The shame. It would bring himself into a state of familial disgrace, his relations and friends despising him for such a catastrophic breach of duty. His lineage, his position, his solemn responsibilities to the past and future of his name, all would be sacrificed for a pair of fine eyes and a quick wit. It is ruinous, he muttered into the silence of the room. Utterly untenable. He could calm himself down with this rational, cold reckoning. He would decide with firm finality not to think about her anymore. He would compartmentalize the memory, seal it away, and proceed with his life as a man dictated by his duty, not his transient passions. But the moment the decision was made, the revolt began. His feelings, the deep, aching certainty of his heart, took over him with insidious speed. The deductive logic fractured under the weight of longing. If she was so ill-connected, why did her presence make the world brighter? If her family was so horrid, why did his own cold life feel so utterly vacant without the possibility of her warmth? His melancholy took hold, pulling him deeper into a profound sense of isolation. His pride, which had once been his shield, was now transmuted into an agonizing awareness of his own foolishness. He, Fitzwilliam Darcy, master of thousands, was enslaved by an obscure young woman whom he could neither claim nor forget. The weight of the house, the silence of London, the endless repetition of his internal conflict, it all pressed upon him until he felt he could not draw another breath of the stale, luxurious air. He needed a break, a decisive cut in the thread of his routine. He needed occupation, distraction, diversion. He recalled the letter sitting amongst the stacks of correspondence on his desk, an imperious summons from his aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, insisting upon his presence at Rosings Park in Kent for several weeks. Usually the prospect of his aunt's demanding hospitality filled him with a dutiful dread. Now the thought of Kent, of the change of scene, the rigorous schedule, and the ceaseless, high-toned conversation offered a desperate semblance of relief. It was a movement, a flight from the specter haunting his library. He strode over to the desk, his decision instantaneous and urgent. He sat and drafted a brief, formal reply, accepting the invitation, sealing the wax with a violent stamp of his signet ring. Perhaps amongst the stiff formalities and the overbearing presence of Lady Catherine, he could find distraction enough to starve the phantom of Hertfordshire. He knew it was a vain hope, a temporary anesthetic at best, but he was drowning, and Kent was the nearest shore. He was condemned to a hopelessness he could not escape, but he could at least flee the room where the sentence had been passed. Chapter 7. The vast, intimidating grandeur of Rosings Park had always been a fortress of propriety for Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy. He had come to Kent seeking the cold comfort of duty and the numbing efficiency of Lady Catherine's society. He had specifically sought distraction, a reprieve from the insistent, humiliating memory of a pair of bright eyes and a tongue too sharp for social grace. He found instead a refined and systematic form of torture. Elizabeth Bennet was there. She was not a figment of his fevered imagination, but a concrete, observable reality, visiting her cousin Mr. Collins and his new wife Charlotte. She was positioned daily within his sphere, yet impossibly far away, separated by a thin membrane of polite indifference that was more agonizing than outright enmity. The first sight of her, seated demurely across the drawing room at Rosings, discussing the merits of a new floral pattern with Charlotte Collins, had almost caused Darcy to betray his customary composure. The shock quickly curdled into a heavy, sinking feeling of despair. In Hertfordshire, Elizabeth had been the lively, defiant creature who challenged him. Her dislike had been a potent, engaging force. Here, however, at Hunsford Parsonage, and in the stifling confines of Rosings's evening calls, her disdain was remarkably absent. She was civil, she was temperate. She offered him the courtesy due to his station, and nothing more. Oh, and that was the true agony. Her previous dislike, he realized, had at least acknowledged his presence. It had been a reaction, a heated response to him. Her current indifference was the icy certainty that he did not matter enough to warrant strong emotion. She spoke to Colonel Fitzwilliam with easy, laughing familiarity, discussed gardening with Mrs. Collins, and endured Lady Catherine with playful, minimal submission. When her eyes met Darcy's, they were merely polite, neither softening nor hardening. They registered him as an architectural feature of the room. His days became a series of small, excruciating observations. He watched her walk the muddy lane toward the village, her skirt lifted slightly, her step light. He watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration while reading. He watched her smile, a genuine, unreserved expression rarely offered in his direction. Darcy had believed his feelings for her to be a matter of pride and inconvenience, a weakness to be overcome. He now understood they were an infection that invaded every limb, sapping his will and his reason. Rosings, intended as a cure, had become the location of the disease's final, crippling progress. He could not escape her. If he walked in the park, he might glimpse her in the distance. If he stayed indoors, he heard Lady Catherine demanding news of the Collinses, and thus news of Elizabeth. His own cousin, Colonel Fitzwilliam, seemed to spend an inordinate amount of time at the parsonage, returning to Rosings with tales of Elizabeth's spirit and wit, innocently twisting the knife in Darcy's side. Sleep offered no relief. He woke each morning to the immediate heavy weight of his love, a burden he was no longer strong enough to bear. And his pride fought a desperate, losing battle. What was this miserable existence? A great gentleman, master of Pemberley, reduced to haunting the edge of a muddy village, watching a woman who did not care whether he lived or died. His life, so perfectly ordered, had dissolved into a restless, aching emptiness that only Elizabeth Bennet could fill. The thought, when it finally arrived, was revolutionary in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. He did not need her approval. He needed her presence. He needed to stop the ceaseless ache of longing that had replaced every other sensation. He walked into the Rosings library on a bleak, rain-swept afternoon. The fire did not warm him. He stood staring out at the gray, weeping landscape, the image of Elizabeth laughing at the dinner table, a laugh not directed at him, burning in his mind. He despised the situation. He despised her ability to inflict this pain without intent. He despised himself for his weakness. But most of all, he despised the crushing daily reality of a life that did not contain her. Every measure of his rational, calculated pride surrendered in that moment to the overwhelming need for cessation of pain. The misery of watching her, untouchable and indifferent, was a slow death. He did not want to marry Elizabeth Bennet. He had to. It was not a grand gesture of enduring passion, but a desperate act of self-preservation. It was the only escape from the hell of proximity without possession. "I cannot endure this," he muttered to the empty room. "This misery of life is insupportable." The decision crystallized with sudden, terrible clarity. He did not pause to consider propriety, Lady Catherine's disapproval, or even the certainty of Elizabeth's refusal. He only knew he had to speak, to force the issue, to break the unbearable cycle of hope and disillusionment. Even a sharp, final rejection would shatter the current, agonizing equilibrium. Darcy strode toward the door. He felt reckless, driven, stripped bare of all his customary reserve. It was raining harder now, but he did not notice the weather. He had to cross the park, make his way to the small, humble parsonage, find her, and deliver himself from this agonizing fate. He pulled on his coat and gloves with a violence that was wholly uncharacteristic. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He was not going to woo her. He was going to save himself. He stepped out into the mud in the driving rain, heading toward the small cottage where, he knew, against every rule of sense and society, waited the woman who held the key to his peace, or the instrument of his final, decisive ruin. Chapter 8. Darcy sat horrified at his desk in his room in Rosings Park, the heavy velvet curtains admitting only a sliver of the cold spring light. The words, sharp as shards of glass, still echoed in the opulent silence, each syllable a fresh laceration to his pride, his very sense of self. Elizabeth Bennet had refused him, not merely declined, but utterly repudiated, ensuring that he was, by her own emphatic declaration, the last man in the world whom she could ever be prevailed upon to marry. The sheer audacity of her rejection had initially stunned him into silence, but the ensuing tirade had left him reeling. She had not only repeated her accusations regarding supposed wrongs toward Wickham, giving his insidious lies the weight of her conviction, but had also informed him, with a cutting clarity, that she would never marry a man who had been a tool to cause such heartbreak for her beloved sister. The wound of her disdain was deep, but even deeper was the precise, unsparing accuracy of her final blow, his proud and haughty demeanor, his utter disrespect for the feelings of others. His first reaction had been a searing indignation, a sense of outrage that such impertinence would be directed at him, Fitzwilliam Darcy, of Pemberley. How dare she, a woman of her inferior connections and lack of fortune, speak to him so? His arguments, his justifications for Wickham's treatment, for his interference in Bingley's affairs, had been dismissed as the mere ramblings of an arrogant fool. He had wanted to rage, to storm from the room and never look upon her impertinent face again. But as the initial fury began to subside, replaced by a cold, unsettling quiet, a different sensation began to creep into his consciousness. It was a faint, unwelcome whisper that grew steadily louder, cutting through the defensive clamor of his own thoughts. A sliver of truth, his proud and haughty demeanor, his disrespect of the feelings of others. The accusations resonated with an alarming force because perhaps they were not entirely untrue. He had always held himself aloof, a necessary defense, he had believed. His experience in London, a veritable jungle of mercenary mothers and Byzantine daughters, had taught him how to turn down all who sought to connect themselves to him, not for affection, but for his fortune and his standing. He had spent years perfecting the art of the subtle snub, the dismissive glance, the chillingly polite refusal that conveyed his utter unavailability. He had built walls around himself, intricate fortifications against the predations of the social world, and behind them he had felt safe, unassailable. And he had reflected that attitude constantly in Meryton. He had seen the Bennets noisy, vulgar, with a mother whose sole ambition was to marry off her daughters, any daughters, to any available man. He had seen Jane, sweet and guileless, and Bingley so easily swayed, so transparent in his affections. It had been his duty, he had told himself, to protect his friend from such a misalliance. His coldness, his seemingly disdainful air, had simply been his armor against what he perceived as a threat. He had looked at the whole county, frankly, with a mixture of amusement and contempt. He had worn his supercilious mask with pride, believing it to be a shield. But now, in the chilling aftermath of Elizabeth's condemnation, that armor felt suddenly transparent, revealing not strength but a grotesque caricature of it. He had not merely been prudent, he had been proud, he had not simply been discerning, he had been haughty. He had not merely protected himself and his friend, he had wounded others with his disregard, his utter lack of empathy for their hopes, their feelings, their very humanity. The truth, a bitter draught, began to seep into his consciousness, burning away the dross of his self-deception. Elizabeth had seen past the formidable facade, had stripped him bare with her words, and laid his deepest flaws exposed. He had believed himself impenetrable, but she had found the cracks in his carefully constructed edifice and exposed the hollowness within. He had been so certain of his own rectitude, so convinced of the justice of his actions. But Elizabeth, with her keen intelligence and unyielding moral compass, had forced him to look at himself not through the flattering lens of his own self-importance, but through the harsh, unblinking eyes of another. He had caused pain. He had acted with an arrogant disregard for the consequences on others. He had been, precisely as she had described, the last man in the world, and the horrifying dawning realization was that, perhaps, she was entirely right. He had walked away from Elizabeth Bennet's rejection bruised and enraged, not so much by her words as by the undeniable sting of their truth. But as the initial heat of humiliation slowly receded, replaced by a devastating clarity, he found himself scrutinizing the motivation for his failed enterprise. He had believed utterly that he loved her. Now he interrogated that belief. The truth, stark and painful, stood before him. His proposal had been wholly, miserably selfish. His purpose, he admitted with a sickening lurch, had been nothing more than to be relieved from his own agony and distress. The admiration he felt for her had become a torment, a constant war between his judgment, his pride, and the overwhelming force of her presence. He had sought marriage not as a partnership of reciprocal affection, but as a solution to his private suffering, a means to stop the incessant, disturbing noise she made in his mind. He had detailed his sacrifice, confessed his opposition to her connections, and demanded that she overlook his arrogance. Where in that transaction was selfless love? He allowed his memory to drift to a passage he had heard recited often, a definition that served as the very foundation of Christian virtue, yet which he had utterly failed to embody. 1 Corinthians 13, 4, 7. He mentally recited the principles, testing his recent actions against them. Love suffereth long and is kind. Had he suffered long? Yes, in private, but his proposal was impatient, a rush to claim her. Had he been kind? No, his tone had been censorious, his confession of regard tainted by insult. Love envieth not. Love vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up. He had vaunted his superior social position, boasting of the immense sacrifice he believed he was making. His address had reeked of pride, a boastful declaration that he, the great Mr. Darcy, had condescended to notice her. Doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own. He had behaved with astonishing impropriety, laying his heart before her, while simultaneously insulting everything she held dear. He had sought his own relief, his own satisfaction, caring little for her feelings beyond the expectation of gratitude. Beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. He had borne nothing. He had demanded change. He had come to Meryton fully believing her family was beneath him, and his hope was based entirely on the expectation of his own irresistible consequence. His expressions of regard had not followed that divine model at all. His feeling, he now saw, was a consuming infatuation, a fierce, possessive desire compounded by vanity and the frustration of being denied. It was not love. Elizabeth had been utterly and irrevocably right to refuse him. Her rejection was the just punishment for his unpardonable arrogance. A profound, exhausted sigh escaped him. The acceptance of this humiliation was not without an odd sensation of release. Elizabeth's refusal had been difficult, a shock to his system, but it was nonetheless a resolution. The fever had broken. He would now bury all thoughts of a marriage with Miss Elizabeth Bennet. The pain of the burial would be acute and lasting, but it was still better than years spent in the exhausting agony of an internal conflict that had threatened to unmake him. The path of duty, to Pemberley, to his sister, to the expectations of his name, was clear once more. He rose and paced the room twice, his mind settling into a state of severe, focused assessment. There was, however, one matter in which Elizabeth had been grievously and dangerously wrong. When she had castigated him for his treatment of Mr. Wickham, her convictions had been strong, derived from perceived injury and evident sympathy for a man she believed oppressed. Darcy had listened to her condemnation, paralyzed by both shock and the impossibility of defending himself without betraying a deeply private family secret. But Elizabeth was innocent, credulous, and entirely unaware of the true character of the man she defended. Her error, based on flawed premises, put her and perhaps others in her circle at grave risk. His pride had been shattered. It was now his solemn duty to use the shards of his dignity to protect her. He owed her an explanation, not of love, but of fact. He could not face her, and she would not willingly hear him. A letter. It must be written immediately before Wickham could press his advantage further. The letter must contain no solicitation, no renewed expression of regard, and no complaint regarding her censure. It must be a simple, cold, irrefutable statement of the truth concerning Wickham's perfidy and his true dealings with the Darcy family. Darcy moved to the desk, dipping the quill in ink. His hand was steady, driven now by a purpose purer than his failed proposal. A purpose divorced entirely from the hope of gaining her hand. He wrote not to justify himself to her heart, but to safeguard her reputation and her safety from the man her current misunderstanding championed. It was an act of genuine, albeit painful forbearance. He began, addressing her with austere formality, ready at last to sacrifice his deepest secret for her protection, to Miss Elizabeth Bennet. Chapter 9. The ancient stones of Pemberley, steadfast and true, offered Darcy little solace in the immediate aftermath of Hunsford. Yet it was within their familiar, formidable embrace that the true dismantling of his own formidable edifice began. He walked the grounds, the cool morning air biting at his cheeks, and saw nothing but the ghost of Elizabeth Bennet's flashing eyes, heard nothing but the unyielding cadence of her voice. She had stripped him bare, not with a blade, but with a truth so stark, so undeniable, that it resonated in the very marrow of his bones. "You are too proud, Mr. Darcy. Your motive was to divide, not to unite. I had not known you a month before I felt that you were the last man in the world whom I could ever be prevailed upon to marry." Each phrase echoed, no longer causing hot indignation, but a chilling recognition. She had revealed his true motives, yes, but more profoundly, she had laid bare the very architecture of his heart. He had built a wall, piece by deliberate piece, bricked with ancestral pride, painted with societal disdain, cemented with a fear of vulnerability. He had believed it protected him from the hurts of the world, from the commonness, the impropriety, the emotional messiness he had witnessed after his parents' death. It was a fortress, impenetrable and grand. But Elizabeth had seen it for what it was, a cage, a barrier that did not merely keep others out, but kept him in. It had insulated him, yes, but it had also caused insults and suffering. It had driven away Bingley from Jane. It had perpetuated Wickham's villainy through his own silence. And most damningly, it had alienated the one woman who had ever seen beyond the facade to the man within. And then, in righteous fury, rejected him for the very defenses he had so carefully constructed. Slowly, painstakingly, the work began. It was not a sudden collapse, but a meticulous, often painful deconstruction. He started by simply listening more intently to his tenants, not just hearing their requests, but discerning the unspoken anxieties beneath. He found himself offering a genuine smile to an aged gardener, asking about his family with sincere interest rather than detached benevolence. The stiffness in his shoulders, a lifelong companion, began to ease. He learned to admit when he was wrong, first to himself, then in small, tentative ways to his trusted steward, then to his sister, Georgiana. The words felt foreign on his tongue, raw and exposing, but with each admission, a stone seemed to loosen from his internal wall. He observed the discomfort, the slight shock in their eyes, followed by a surprising warmth, a deeper connection that had always been just out of reach. Vulnerability, he discovered, was not weakness. It was a perilous yet profoundly human bridge. He could not forget Elizabeth. Her wit, her spirit, her uncompromising honesty, they were etched into his soul. Yet his attitude toward her had undergone an essential, transformative shift. The demanding tone, the arrogant expectation that she must see his worth, that she must overlook his faults for the sake of his fortune and family had melted away. In its place bloomed a profound, aching gratitude. In his evening prayers, in the hushed solitude of his study, kneeling before the window that framed the ancient oaks, he no longer prayed for forgetfulness or for her return. Instead, he thanked God for her. He thanked God for Elizabeth Bennet, for her courageous heart and her incisive mind, for being the unwelcome yet ultimately saving instrument of truth. She had held up a mirror he had refused to see, and in its reflection, he had found not just a proud, disdainful man, but the potential for something far better, truer. He would ever respect and admire her, perhaps more than any other being he had known. Her image was forever intertwined with his awakening, and even without any hope of marriage to her, he knew, with a quiet certainty, that a part of him would forever be hers, irrevocably changed and eternally grateful. The wall was down, and though the landscape of his heart felt exposed and new, it was, at last, truly his own. Chapter 10. The late summer sun slanted through the tall windows of the Pemberley drawing room, dusting the worn leather of the books in the gleam of the mahogany with a golden warmth. This atmosphere of deep, unhurried peace had become Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy's most cherished possession. He sat at his desk pretending to review estate accounts, but his true attention was anchored across the room, where Elizabeth Bennet was reading aloud to his sister. She had come to visit Pemberley together with Aunt and Uncle Gardner. Elizabeth's voice, clear and lively, was a continuous source of delight. She read with the theatrical flourish that made even the dullest passages sparkle, and when she paused to make a witty comment on the author's absurdity, Georgiana would release a peal of genuine, unfettered laughter. Darcy had never seen Georgiana so well. The shy girl who had carried the weight of her past mortification like a physical mantle now moved with an increasing lightness. Elizabeth had not demanded it. She had simply been herself, open, intelligent, and unreserved, weaving Georgiana into her confidence until the shell began to crack. Darcy's heart swelled with a gratitude so immense it overshadowed his former pride entirely. This was the happiness he had sought without knowing its name. It was effortless, rooted in shared respect and laughter, untainted by the demands of society or the complexities of courtship. He loved her, yes, but more powerfully, he was indebted to her. He would do anything for Elizabeth Bennet. He had often contemplated how he might truly thank her, beyond mere words, for the priceless gift of Georgiana's revival. As if sensing his gaze, Elizabeth looked up, catching his eye over the edge of her volume. She offered him a quick, conspiratorial smile, a flash of pure sunshine, before returning to her reading. It was exactly at that moment when the world seemed perfect and settled, that the door opened. The footman, pale and hesitant, carried a single black-sealed letter on a silver tray. It was addressed to Miss Bennet, and the urgency in its folding and the unfamiliar, trembling hand in which it was penned spoke of calamity. Elizabeth took the letter. The laughter died on her lips as she recognized the seal of her sister Jane. She broke the wax quickly, her brow furrowing with apprehension. As she scanned the first few lines, the very color drained from her face. The pages rustled in her grasp, and she rose abruptly, clutching the paper to her chest as if wounded. "Elizabeth, what is it?" Darcy was instantly on his feet, crossing the room in 3 strides. Georgiana watched, startled, her former confidence dissipating instantly at the sight of distress. Elizabeth could not speak. Her eyes were wide, haunted, fixed on a point beyond the opulent walls of Pemberley, into a world of disgrace and irreparable damage. She simply shook her head, a silent, sickening denial of the reality contained in the desperate handwriting. Darcy gently took the letter from her unresisting fingers. He read quickly, the carefully constructed piece of his day shattering into fragments of cold, hard dread. The scoundrel. The words burned off the page. Lydia Wickham, ruined, London, no trace. The youngest Bennet sister, barely 16, had fled with George Wickham. There was no marriage, no intention of one, only flight and complete, devastating disgrace. The implication was clear. The family name was blackened. Elizabeth's future, the reputations of Jane and the entire family unit, were now hanging by the frailest thread of hope, a hope Darcy knew Wickham would never honor. He knew Wickham. He knew the man's callous selfishness, his debt, his predatory nature. This was not a youthful indiscretion. It was calculated malice, the final, vicious thrust of a man determined to destroy everything decent. Darcy looked at Elizabeth. She had retreated to the nearest chair, leaning her head back, her eyes closed, tears tracking silently down her temples. She was devastated. The shock was profound, crippling. The scandal would not only ruin her family, but it would utterly destroy Elizabeth's spirit. It would condemn her to a life shadowed by shame, a life where her wonderful wit and intelligence would be overlooked beneath the stigma of a ruined sister. The thought of Elizabeth, that bright sunshine in his life, being dimmed by the darkness of Wickham's villainy, was intolerable. That would not do. His mind clicked immediately into action, cold and ruthless. All gratitude, all love, all the promises he had silently made to himself coalesced into a fierce protective resolve. Elizabeth's family could do nothing. Mr. Bennet would retreat to his library in despair and irony. Mrs. Bennet would weep hysterically, accomplishing nothing. Mr. Gardiner, though kind, did not possess the specific power, reach, or sheer lack of scruple required to deal with a man like Wickham. It demanded power. It demanded money. It demanded anonymity. It demanded him. He strode to Elizabeth and knelt beside her chair, gently taking her hands, which were icy cold. "Elizabeth, look at me," he commanded, his voice deep and steady, betraying none of the turmoil racing through his thoughts. She opened her eyes, swollen and miserable. "Oh, Mr. Darcy, this is the end of us all." "It is not," he asserted firmly. "I understand the situation. I understand the severity of the disgrace. But I promise you, this is not the end." He needed to leave. Now. London was the most likely place for a runaway couple to hide before the money ran out. He needed a detailed plan, a trail of gold, and a heavy dose of intimidation. He could not involve Elizabeth in the sordid details. He only needed her to trust him. He rose and looked at Georgiana, who stood frozen, watching the crisis unfold. "Georgiana, please ring for a maid to assist Miss Bennet, and fetch me maps of the city, the old ones detailing the less reputable quarters." He turned back to Elizabeth, his eyes burning with intent. "Elizabeth, I am leaving for London immediately, tonight." She looked up at the sudden resolution in his face, confused. "London? Mr. Darcy, you cannot. It is my family's disgrace. You have no obligation. I have every obligation, he cut in fiercely. You gave back my sister to me. You gave back my peace. There is nothing I will not do to ensure your happiness is restored. He could not articulate the full scope of his mission, tracking down the blackguard, forcing a marriage through financial coercion, settling Wickham's insurmountable debts, paying him off to disappear forever. He could not tell her he was about to risk his own reputation and compromise his morals to save her sister from infamy. Not yet. I may be gone for some time, Elizabeth. Tell no one beyond Georgiana where I have gone or why. I shall write to you privately upon my success. He took her hands again, squeezing them with a force that demanded belief. Wickham will not succeed in this. What is ruined can be saved. I owe you everything, Elizabeth. Allow me this opportunity to repay my debt. Then, without waiting for a reply, he turned toward the door. The peaceful summer idyll of Pemberley was over. Darcy was no longer the content master of a great estate. He was a man with a singular, desperate mission to descend into the filth of London society and redeem the honor of the woman he loved, whatever the cost to himself. The time for gratitude was past. Now was the time for action. Chapter 11. The crisp autumn air, carrying the scent of decaying leaves and damp earth, swirled around Elizabeth as she walked beside Mr. Darcy towards Oakham Mount. He had returned to Meryton with Mr. Bingley, a presence that felt both comfortably familiar and, in these quiet moments, almost extraneous. For Darcy, it was Elizabeth who held his undivided attention. He walked with a lightness he hadn't known before, his usual reserve softened by an internal contentment that radiated from him. The rhythm of their footsteps, a gentle accompaniment to the rustle of their skirts and the distant call of a bird, was music to his ears. This simple act of walking, of being near her, filled him with a profound sense of rightness. It wasn't just companionship he felt. It was a deep, resonant connection, an unspoken understanding that transcended words. He found himself wishing, with a surprising intensity, that these moments could stretch into an eternity, that he need never be separated from her company. The path wound through a copse of trees, dappled sunlight falling through the thinning canopy. Elizabeth, who had been walking in thoughtful silence, finally broke it. Her voice, clear and melodious, carried a sincerity that made Darcy's heart swell. "Mr. Darcy," she began, her gaze fixed on the winding track ahead. I must express my deepest gratitude. What you did for my family, it was an act of such extraordinary kindness, of such immense sacrifice." Darcy's steps faltered for a fraction of a second. He felt a blush creep up his neck, a sensation he found both mortifying and, strangely, welcome. He had anticipated this conversation, had braced himself for it, yet her heartfelt words still caught him off guard. Elizabeth continued, her voice gaining a little more strength as she spoke. "To have found Wickham, and then to have gone to such lengths to secure Lydia's marriage, without a thought for the scandal it might bring upon yourself. You have no idea, Mr. Darcy, of the ruin you averted, the costs you bore, the efforts you made. You saved us all." She turned to him then, her intelligent eyes shining with an emotion he could only interpret as profound admiration and gratitude. "You spared no expense, no effort, to bring that wretched man to heel and to ensure our family's honor. It was a burden I feared we would all carry forever." Darcy felt a heat bloom in his cheeks, a discomfort born not of shame, but of an acute awareness of her perception of him. He was accustomed to being judged, often harshly, but to be seen in this light by her was a profound and almost overwhelming experience. He cleared his throat, his voice a little rougher than usual. "Miss Bennet," he replied, choosing his words carefully, You misunderstand the extent of my concern." He hesitated, searching for the right phrasing. "I could not, in good conscience, allow you to face such a tragedy, such a personal devastation, without doing everything within my power to mitigate it. The situation was dire, and your family's distress was a matter of great moment to me." He met her gaze, a quiet intensity in his own. "To have done nothing would have been unthinkable. I simply acted as I felt I must." He could not bring himself to admit how much of his motivation stemmed from his overwhelming desire to protect her from the fallout. The thought of her enduring shame, her happiness dimmed by such a disgrace, had been unbearable. Elizabeth paused, turning slightly to face him, her eyes fixed on his profile. So much less proud, so much more gentle than she remembered. "Mr. Darcy," she began, her voice soft but earnest. "We are very much past the time for apologies, I know. But as we walk here enjoying this peace that I once thought unimaginable between us, I feel I must express my regret." Darcy stopped, meeting her gaze with an expression of attentive curiosity. "I regret the manner in which I refused your proposal at Hunsford Parsonage," she continued, a blush rising faintly on her cheeks. "I was prejudiced, yes, but I was also intolerably rude. My language was harsh and deliberately insulting. I had no right to wound your feelings as deeply as I did." Darcy's lips curved into a slight rueful smile. He stepped closer, his demeanor radiating a quiet humility that was profoundly moving to her. "Miss Bennet," he said, his deep voice rich with sincerity, "it is I who have waited for this moment, though not for your apology, but for the chance to offer my own. I must confess that your refusal and the severity of your criticism was the most necessary and salutary lesson of my life." He ran a hand through his dark hair, looking out over the expanse of his estate, yet seeing only the memory of his past arrogance. "My proposal was selfish, arrogant, and insulting," he admitted freely. "I spoke of your inferiority, highlighted the supposed degradation of your connections, and imagined that I was doing you a favor. I demanded love while offering disrespect. It was a disgrace. I thank you, Elizabeth, from the very core of my being, that you were cruel enough to be truthful." He turned back to her, his eyes warm and direct. "You tore down the massive walls I had built around my heart, walls composed of pride, consequence, and a fearful disdain for those who did not meet my exacting standards. You revealed me to myself. For that painful but vital service, I am eternally grateful." Elizabeth felt a profound easing in her spirit. His sincerity was unquestionable, his introspection complete. She smiled, a genuine, luminous expression that lit up her eyes. "Indeed, Mr. Darcy," she replied, stepping forward to resume their ascent, though their pace remained slow. "I have noted a remarkable change in your behavior. Your kindness to the people here, your effortless humility in speaking to me now, and, most importantly, your remarkable behavior concerning my sister and Mr. Wickham." She paused at the summit of the mount, where the view opened up to miles of emerald countryside. She took a deep breath, turning to him with an unreserved honesty that matched his own. "I find," she confessed, her voice dropping to an intimate murmur, "that I like you now, Mr. Darcy. Very much indeed." The simple declaration, spoken without artifice or coquetry, struck Darcy with a force that made his breath catch. He had hoped for reconciliation, perhaps for friendship, but the quiet warmth and directness of her admission surpassed all his expectations. A wave of indescribable joy washed over him, banishing the lingering shadows of past misjudgments. He felt the reserve he had worked so hard to maintain since leaving Netherfield finally, irrevocably shatter. He reached out, tentatively taking her hands in his. Her skin was warm and soft against his own, and the contact felt immeasurably right. "Elizabeth," he breathed, the use of her given name escaping him without conscious thought, heavy with emotion. His eyes, usually so guarded, were now clear and intense, reflecting the earnestness of his soul. "I love you," he confessed, the words ringing with an authority and clarity that had been absent from his first, stumbling proposal. "I love you more than ever, more than with the blind vanity that first propelled me to Hunsford. Everything I have done, every improvement I have sought, has been for the honor of being worthy of your good opinion. The hope of winning you has been my sole motivation." He brought her hands up to his lips for a brief, reverent kiss. I ask you again, Elizabeth, with all the humility and sincerity my heart can muster. Will you be my wife? Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming happiness. This proposal was everything the first had lacked: tender, respectful, and born of genuine understanding. There was no hesitation, no doubt, only a deep, resounding certainty. She squeezed his hands tightly, a radiant smile transforming her face. Yes, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, yet ringing with complete conviction. Yes, Mr. Darcy, with all my heart, I will. Darcy's relief was immediate and profound. He released a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding, and for a glorious moment, the world narrowed to the two of them, standing atop Oakham Mount, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. He did not speak, but drew her gently into an embrace. As he held her close, feeling the light, perfect weight of her in his arms, Darcy knew the walls were finally gone. He had found his heart's true home, and it was in the fearless, intelligent, and infinitely beloved woman he now held. The arduous journey, filled with pride, prejudice, and painful self-discovery, had led him at last to this pinnacle of perfect joy.